Thank you, Julia. Thank you, panel, for this most interesting discussion. We are now coming to the last part of our forum, namely the so-called concluding session. And this concluding session has two titles. One is, what would Drucker say now? And the other, what have we learned? And we are going to organize this session in two parts. First of all, we are going to have two contributions trying to answer these questions. Then we will take some of the inputs we received from you and discuss them as a part of the conclusion, and then I will bring that to a close. So this is what we are going to do now. And I'm happy to welcome on stage the two first speakers during that concluding session. The first one you heard already this morning, Rick Wartzman, the Executive Director of the Drucker Institute, and then Steve Denning. Steve was during a long time the head of knowledge management from the World Bank, so you can imagine the kind of issues he dealt with, then became an author and a consultant on leadership storytelling, notably, on innovation, created the notion of radical management, and has a column in the Forbes review. So Rick, you represent the true doctrine of Mr. Drucker, the true orthodoxy of Peter Drucker. So tell us how you saw what we have experienced, and then Steve will give his answer. On the stage too is another colleague, Lukas Michel. Lukas is a very experienced international businessman, has worked around the globe, and is the founder and owner of AgilityINsights, which is a management consulting company, and has notably written a book which enables companies to self-assess their performance, called the Performance Triangle. And Lukas will deal with the various inputs we got from you and what we are doing with these inputs. So let's start, Rick, with the true doctrine.
Hello? Okay, there we go. So I guess as I've tried to kind of look through a Drucker prism, a Drucker lens over the last couple days, the first thing that occurred to me is that I think Peter Drucker himself was in some ways a complex system. And I mean complexity in the truest sense, right? His mind was agile, dynamic, certainly resilient, but also highly unpredictable. And so only a fool would sit here and really try and say, what would Drucker think of all this? Because invariably he'd be wrong. So with that huge caveat out there first, I will give it a shot and try and connect some dots between what we've heard over the last couple days and some of Peter's writing and thinking. So the first thing, and I sort of captured a list that dovetails somewhat with what Linda came up with, and it varies in some places of kind of the quick checklist of some of the lessons from here. The first one, and I think he would seize on, is we heard quite a bit from the executive panel and from Don and Tim and others, which was the idea to be humble. I think Peter would have absolutely started there. When you look at what he actually wrote about complexity and true complexity, you find a little bit in his 1989 book, The New Realities. And he invoked the famous butterfly effect and talked about that a little bit. And he noted in there, he said that the climate is predictable and has high stability. The weather is not predictable and is totally unstable, the weather being truly complex. Of course, now I'm not so sure that's even true about climate anymore, since that was written. But that said, he thought about the ways that people tried to then manage really complex situations. And he thought, because you really can't manage things that are totally unstable and highly unpredictable, we often make a mess of it. And he invoked, and I apologize to all the economists in the room, but he pointed to economists who I think he thought often confused their ability to reasonably predict climates with an ability to understand and thereby control the weather. So he referred to them as economist kings and who thought they were infallible. And we've all seen this through history, right? The economists who in the 40s thought that we could maintain full employment, generate and maintain full employment, and that didn't happen. We've all heard more recently how we can tame business cycles, and that hasn't really worked out very well. Or, how we can engineer soft landings, and, we're in the middle of a really hard landing still right now. So again, I think Peter would have said, when it comes to complexity, be humble. It's telling, too, that he said Peter said the book he always wished that he had written but didn't get around to write was one he would have titled Managing Ignorance. And he said he would have called it Managing Ignorance because there was always so much more that we don't know than we do know. And if we could actually figure out what we don't know and be aware of those blind spots, that would be a pretty good bit of progress. He also used to tell his students, you must frequently approach problems with your ignorance, not with what you think you know from past experience, because not infrequently what you think you know is wrong. So again, I'd start with being humble. The second thing we heard a lot about that I think he would have loved was this idea of kind of radically decentralizing. Peter, of course, believed very strongly in what a lot of people term bottom-up management. It's the basis of management by objectives, right? You push responsibility and accountability as far down into the organization as possible. And so I think he would have been very intrigued by this notion of self-organizing institutions. I think he would have found that as kind of continuing on that, down that same line and pushing that idea even further. And certainly there are more and more opportunities, as we've heard over the past couple days, to do that because of technology. And to that end, Peter wrote, the new technology will demand the utmost in decentralization. Any enterprise that attempted to centralize decision-making at the top is destined to perish miserably. It would go under, he wrote, like the great reptiles of the Saurian age, who attempted to control a huge body by a small centralized nervous system that could not adapt to rapid change in the environment. Now, it's a great passage, I think, and what's really amazing is he wrote that in the practice of management in 1954. So not quite 1868 or whatever Roger invoked, but pretty impressive. The third point I think that Peter would have seized on was the idea to embrace integrative thinking. Roger spoke beautifully about that. Others have touched on that as well, Helga and others, through the 2 days. And I think that, for Drucker, this was all about the notion of management as a liberal art, what Peter termed management as a liberal art. And I just want to read again one short section because it really captures this. Management, and I think he meant management properly practiced, but not often practiced, deals with action and application, and its test is its results. This makes it a technology. But management also deals with people, their values, their growth and development, and this makes it a humanity. Management is thus what tradition used to call a liberal art, liberal because it deals with the fundamentals of knowledge, self-knowledge, wisdom, and leadership, art because it is practice and application. Managers, Drucker continued, draw on all the knowledge and insights of the humanities and the social sciences, on psychology and philosophy, on economics and on history, on the physical sciences and on ethics. So talk about integrative thinking, I think that really captures it beautifully. And there was this great story, it may be apocryphal, but I think it captures a lot of it, where supposedly a young person once asked Peter, how can I be a better manager? And his answer was, learn to play the violin. So pretty fantastic. I think that next he would have seized on the idea, and we've heard a lot about this, of creating organizations, creating as organizations, and then as individuals taking advantage of them, of opportunities for lifelong learning. Knowledge workers, Peter said, must have continuous learning built into their tasks, And a knowledge organization has to be both a learning organization and a teaching organization. Knowledge today in all areas changes so fast that knowledge workers become obsolete pretty soon unless they build continuous learning into their work. I think he would have next loved this idea of putting the customer at the center of everything. That obviously is so true to everything Peter wrote and wrote repeatedly throughout his life, right? As we know, he said there was only one valid definition of business purpose: to create a customer. And I think he would have, again, seen complexity as opportunity if it meant the ability to interact more directly with customers and have the customer at the center of everything, and even have more power put into customers' hands, a theme we've heard repeatedly. He would have loved the idea, all the times we've invoked over the last couple days, the need to continually innovate. Again, this has come up over and over. I'd point you to his 1985 book, Innovation and Entrepreneurship, where he talks about the need to continually innovate. Next, I would say that he would have looked to, I've heard a lot about the word simplify. I would think maybe a better word is clarify. Again, in the midst of so much complexity, when things are unpredictable, I think you'd want to try and do away with the complications so you can deal with the actual complexity better. Kurt Pullen from Herman Miller touched on the idea of planned abandonment. Stop doing things that are no longer yielding results and that are getting in the way of producing tomorrow. Planned abandonment would be a big piece of that. Avoiding information overload was something that Peter wrote about in an HBR article called The Coming of the New Organization. And we've heard about the importance of that. With so much data available, making sure that the data that winds up in people's hands is actually useful and nothing more. And we heard a lot about that in the breakout session here this afternoon. And another way to clarify that Peter absolutely lived by, of course, was to ask lots of questions over and over and over again. And I think some of his most basic questions he would have said are important to ask again and again at a time of complexity. So what is our business and what should it be? Very actually difficult to answer in a complex environment, and one that's bound to change quite a bit. Who is our customer and what is the customer value? Again, things that may seem simple but are actually in a complex environment going to constantly be changing. He would have loved the idea of reaching beyond our own walls that John Hagel talked about. And in his book, Management Challenges for the 21st Century, Drucker called this bringing in the meaningful outside, and there's quite a lot there. And then I'll leave you with one more. I have a few more, but I want to turn it over to Steve, and I will leave you with one more. And I kind of bookended, start by being humble, and I will end with this one, because I think maybe those are the two most important. And this is something we've also heard, is to maintain a commitment to values in a time of complexity. Eve Droz this morning during the government panel talked about being guided by a set of core values. That becomes increasingly important as you climb that complexity curve. Charles Handy began by talking about getting the order right, passion, people, and profit. And having those kind of guiding principles, those core values, I think are so essential at this time. And Umar actually, I thought, quite forcibly and in ways, probably language that Peter wouldn't have used, but really hit on some very important things. And when you talk about what kind of values, I just want to leave you with this passage from the Ecological Vision, which Peter wrote in 1993. Drucker noted in there that he, believed in economic costs being calculated and taken into account. He certainly believed in the desire of profitability and organizations being sustainable and profitable. I believe in free markets, he added, having seen far too much of the alternative. But still, for me, the economic sphere is one sphere rather than the sphere. Economic considerations are restraints rather than overriding determinants. Economic wants and economic satisfactions are important, but not absolutes. Above all, economic activities, economic institutions, economic rationality are means to non-economic, that is, human or social ends, rather than ends in themselves. So I will leave it there.
Very good. Very impressive to see how rich and actual Mr. Drucker thought is. Steve, how did you look at that?
I think he would have been impressed by the common ground of the many speakers from these very, very different backgrounds have come here and really reached very common views on issues. Maybe, as Julia suggested, we have clearer questions than perfect answers, but a consensus about what the questions are. I think he would have loved the shared passion of the speakers. That's one thing that really struck me, is that sometimes management is regarded as a rather dreary subject, but everyone here thinks management matters, that management affects more lives more profoundly than almost anything else that we do as a species. And when you only have 11% of people passionately involved in their work, that I think he would regard as a tragedy, as the 21st century, as that the best that the human race can manage. I think he would have certainly endorsed Doris Drucker's point that information revolution is not about communication. It's a much bigger thing about human behavior and human values. I think he would also have been struck by the realism of what was discussed here. Many business conferences you go and you'll hear about the blue sky and how everything is wonderful and the record profits and the stock market is booming, and there's less attention paid to the financial meltdown that was caused by complexity and the fact that we still haven't recovered from that. And this was a conference in which many speakers described the performance of our organizations as grim. These organizations are in trouble. John Hagel's reference to the shift index study, where the rate of return on assets is only 1/4 of what it was in 1965, and the passion of workers only 11%. Those kinds of studies are not often central in business conferences, and I think he would have applauded the realism of this conference. Other speakers also underlined the fact that our organizations are not working very well. They're in trouble. George Kepich said line organizations don't work anymore. Don Tapscott, our organizational models are wrong. Charles Handy, the inhumanity of our firms and the helicopter parenting that doesn't work. Tim Brown talked about the fear-based environments and the lack of creative confidence. Imar Haq talked about the cynicism and mistrust in organization, an age of failure. Our organizations fail us. If 80% of organizations disappeared, who would care? And Don Tapscott, our organizations have run out of gas. And we're at a punctuation point in history where we need fundamental change. So all of the speakers have been underlining that our organizations are in trouble and are in need of significant change. The third point, I think you would have been impressed that there is a convergence on what our organizations should look like, how they should deal with complexity. I was struck by the commonality between the public sector and the private sector discussions, very similar kind of diagnosis and answer. And although speakers refer to these issues with different terms, really a great deal of common ground between them. Don Tapscott talks about it in terms of self-organizing networks. John Hagel talks about scalable learning. Tim Brown talks about design thinking of different ecosystems fit for the creative economy. Frederick Malek talks about a new world, old world organizations moving to a new world, and those that don't adapt will suffer extinction. And we're looking at a great transformation we saw in the public sector discussion also about learning from positive deviance and survival with the fittest rather than survival of the fittest. These are different ways of talking about what I believe is a convergence on a different way of thinking about organizations. And I think that convergence you would see more clearly if it was looked at in terms of the subset of
organizations. 5 dimensions of organizations: goals, structure, coordination, values, and communication. If you look at each of those, one can see how much convergence that there is, both with the foundations that Peter Drucker himself laid, but also between the speakers themselves. Peter Drucker's foundational insight, the only valid purpose of a private sector firm is to create a customer, is something that has underlaid many of the interventions that we heard here. Somebody commented that they'd never heard the word purpose used as often as they had in this conference. And Fredman Malik pointed out money-driven economy won't work. Rick Goings, purpose is the glue that holds people together. And Charles Handy, money becomes the point, you have lost the point. And all of these suggesting that the preoccupation with shareholder value over the last couple of decades missed the turn that Peter Drucker pointed out in 1973, that is not really the purpose of organizations. If money becomes the purpose, things go badly awry. The purpose of private sector organizations is to create customers, in health to help patients, in education to educate students, in government to help citizens. This reformulation of the goal of organization leads to all of the other changes that we're talking about that enable one to deal with complexity. The structure of organizations that manages going from controllers of individual to enablers of self-organizing teams and networks, both inside the organization and outside, a very, very different way of structuring work in the organization. And thirdly, how work is coordinated. I think in this area, again, there's different terminology used, but a great deal of common ground between the speakers. Tim Brown calls it design thinking, and Harvey Wheaton and Klaus Newman would call it Agile, or Scrum, or Kanban. And Charles Edouard Bouet talks about life footprint, and the military talks about mission command. And we had strategic agility, and test, learn, and adapt in the public sector discussion. All of these are different ways of describing a new way, in the sense of coordinating work, that solves a conundrum that 20th century management didn't ever solve, which was how do you combine discipline, execution with continuous innovation. And 20th century management oscillated between those two goals and never really got it right. These ways of coordinating work, which have evolved really in the last 15 years, resolve that conundrum. They enable both continuous innovation and discipline execution, and they involve, as we heard, working in short iterative cycles, giving autonomy to the people doing the work, getting direct feedback at the end of each cycle, and managers' role shifting from being a controller to someone who enables the work, who enables the emergence of new ideas and removes impediments in the work. And fourthly, values. Values. The 20th century organization, which where efficiency and predictability were the name of the game. Now the values, much more important: transparency, continuous improvement, and sustainability. Transparency, many of the speakers underlined. Chandra was talking about how all data must be available to all levels, how we must visualize and use a big room where we can see what's going on in the organization, and continuous improvement, the need to continuously innovate, because there has been this shift in the balance of power from inside the organization to the customer, to the external part of the organization. And finally, communication. Communication, which used to be in a top-down, one-way direction, is now multi-directional and horizontal as much as it is vertical. Not that vertical disappears, but horizontal becomes much more important. And an interesting story on the front page of the Financial Times this morning about J.P. Morgan, which launched an effort, was about to launch an effort to communicate with its customers with a live session on Twitter, Ask JPN, but had to abandon the effort because it was so overwhelmed by the inflow of negative communications from its customers. This is an old world organization trying to move into the new world and realizing that it hadn't really understood what its current situation is or what its relationship to its customers are. A fairly dramatic example of how these two different worlds are lining up. So I think if we look at each of these dimensions, one can see how the speakers, although using different terminology, and in fact a very similar vision of what these new organization models should look like. And I think he would suggest that Richard suggested at the start of the conference that the forum should be a center of gravity for management. What the consensus that has emerged here provides a solid foundation to provide that center of gravity for management.
Thank you, Steve. I'm getting a little bit worried because there is so much consensus there that, we can feel it in the air. There is too much for my comfort. Now, let me try to get less consensus, if possible. What happened, or what did you hear in these 2 days, which would have escaped Peter Drucker's earlier understanding, and which would maybe even contradict some of the views he held? Rick, what do you see?
Well, I think one thing I touched on, but just to elaborate a little more, because I think it raises an interesting puzzle. So the idea of really self-organized institutions, really autonomous, would I think directionally be in the spirit of what Peter wrote about very much. But I think most of the world, at least as I see it, most of the corporate world, most of the organizational world, hasn't really gotten away from a top-down approach. In other words, they didn't even get as far as where Drucker wanted them to get in the 50s. They're stuck somewhere way up the continuum. So one question I think he'd have, one question I've had in my own mind is, if they haven't even gotten that far, how are they in the world going to get all the way down to being completely self-organized? Do they leapfrog over this step that they've missed entirely, where they're not even really engaging their employees now, as we've heard, and suddenly and magically get to this very new place where their employees are even more autonomous, and hopefully with that have accountability and responsibility and clear direction for what they're at least aiming for? I think there's so much. There's a very long way to go, and I wonder how we're going to get from here to there when we haven't even gotten half the way down the chain yet.
Steve, what do you see?
I think in some areas he would say, "I told you so." Particularly, say the goal of the organization is to create a customer. But I think the area he would be most surprised would be the one that I flagged: how work is coordinated. In his books in the final 10 years of his life, he puzzled over how could we improve the productivity of knowledge work, and saying they hasn't really made much progress on that. What could possibly be done to achieve that? And what happened over the last 15 years was really after he passed away, but he would be surprised and pleased to find what has been achieved in terms of design thinking and Agile and Scrum and light footprint and mission command. All of those things which have evolved in the last 15 years would have been a very pleasant surprise, and he would have, my prediction would be that he would strongly endorse it.
What about the role and power of social communities and, the place they are taking in the economic life? This wasn't anticipated by anybody, not even Peter Drucker, or am I wrong?
Well, Rick would know.
Peter, I think, certainly didn't anticipate social media or anything like that. He was, I think as Charles alluded to at the start of his talk, you know, I don't know if he was quite a technophobe. Doris makes it seem almost like that, if not. And there's one very funny picture, which may be in the program, I think, of Peter holding a mouse, a computer mouse, probably sometime in the late 80s or early 90s. And he looks like he's holding a hand grenade almost. He's so uncomfortable. So I think a lot of the technological advances and what they've enabled in terms of people being able to do a lot of the things that Steve described, putting so much more power in the hands of consumers. I think, he didn't anticipate any of that to the degree it's happened. Certainly. There's some interesting stuff in the age of discontinuity where he does sort of talk about kind of an almost online system without using those words, where teenagers, it talks about, would be able to communicate with each other. Pretty far-seeing, but he was not a technical guy. I just want to make one last point, which is I think he would have liked all this. I mean, he was somebody who distrusted power a lot, and particularly when it was too concentrated. And so the idea that power becomes, less diffuse as long as it doesn't run into total chaos, I think he would like that.
By the way, 20 years ago at the World Economic Forum at Davos, I saw a pretty important chief executive officer who was walking the mouse on the screen in the hope that something would be achieved this way. So, other people are technophobes too. Very good. Any other point? Yeah, Steve.
I think he would have endorsed the point that Don Tapscott made, that technology is not guaranteeing a positive future, that the future is something that needs to be achieved, and that technology could, in fact, lead us down some very bad paths. They could lead us down some very good paths. So these are choices that have to be made, and he would endorse the need to make the right choices. They enable the possibility to have much more interaction and a much more valuable society, but they also create other possibilities that we need to be alert to.
Very good.
Can I say one other point? Yeah, I just want to make one other point, because I think Steve really beautifully hit on the idea that there has been a lot of realism in the room, including that last point. I raised a question to one of the panels, but I think it's largely been missing, and it's a bit of realism, and I think Peter would have been very, very focused on this, which is, particularly in talking about technology and the move to knowledge work, that there really are winners and losers in all this. And there are a lot of human beings, a lot of human lives that are being dislocated because of all this, and in a couple of ways. So one, as we move more to knowledge work, right, Peter wrote that kind of the cousin of knowledge work is service work. But those jobs, by and large, are many on the low end of the economic spectrum. And knowledge workers, by and large, can do very well in this growing creative economy, but he was greatly concerned about service workers and what would happen to them in this period of dislocation. He said that even in the most settled and stable societies, people will be left behind in the shift to knowledge work. He said that service workers are in a particularly tough spot in their social position. Such people are comparable to the proletarians of years ago, the poorly educated masses who thronged the exploding industrial cities and streamed into their factories. And I think that's really important not to lose sight of those folks who are being dislocated by a lot of the things we've talked about. And the second one is just even in the ranks of middle managers who are also being dislocated, right? One of the great things that technology enables and that networking enables, a lot of headquarters, a lot of the centers of organizations, right, are really, they were meant to gather information from all over the place, right, the far-flung parts of the corporate empire, and analyze it and then redistribute it out to the far-flung parts of the empire. It was kind of the central node, right? It was then the relay system. But we don't need that anymore. And so organizations are getting flatter and flatter in some ways, and I think they inevitably will get flatter and flatter. But that also means there are a lot of people who are going to be dislocated because of that. And I think Peter would have been very mindful of those lives tossed, asunder, and would have been very concerned.
Very good, very, very good and interesting point. Excellent. Let's move, Lukas. Can we move to the feedback you gave us? I don't think the crop was overwhelming, but can you tell us more, please?
When Richard Straub approached me to take on this assignment, and these things happened, I think that's quite normal between dinner and midnight on Sunday evenings. I said immediately, yes, of course. I mean, as a manager, that's the response that you're giving here. It dawned on me the night after, when at 3 o'clock in the morning, I suddenly got up and I said, whoops, what did I get myself into here? With my wife next to me, not quite understanding what is going on here. There was quite some ambiguity with what this is all supposed to be. There was quite some uncertainty in how it should be played out. There was quite some dynamics because will it still go that way as it was designed? And I ended up, I think, with a complex problem in a conference that talks about complexity. So it became clear to me that I had to go through a learning experience here. And what does one do? One comes to the conference and starts learning. And retrospectively, I can explain what all happened here. So first of all, I made a choice to be a part of that. And that choice was very important to me because there was no way back. I took responsibility to do it. So one way for me to tackle, I think, that complexity was a choice. Second thing was awareness. From the moment he asked me a question, I started becoming extremely sensitive to the issues around complexity. And that helped me to deal with it tremendously here. And the last thing, maybe that was the most important thing here, is trust. First of all, I had to have trust in myself coming up here and doing this. But secondly, I had to have trust in my colleagues, in Richard, in us doing that here. And it was all there. Thank you. So this was kind of my experience with the diagnostic in the middle at 3 o'clock in the morning in doing this. And with this, I've collected lots of ideas. We have collected the media response. We have collected the box and the emails that came in with some interesting observations and comments. And here is a selection. First of all, the media and social response. As of about 2 o'clock, I think that was the last measurement we took, we had about 3,000 tweets on the entire conference with about 460 users that have a reach of about 10 million people. Okay, that's reach. We had Jean-Alexis Spitz up front here with himself about 400 tweets done during those days. David Anderson, I think I need to look up there somewhere, with more than 100 tweets. And Don Ponte Fract with almost, I think, around 100 tweets here. I think this is quite amazing here. Okay.
So the prize is?
Come back next year. So this is kind of what we had from the social media. Then from the direct feedback, we have asked one gentleman to actually come up and give his 15-second thoughts on what he actually put down on his note, which is thoughts, concepts, ideas for today and the future. David Hurst, would you quickly come up and explain your note? Just come up.
Well, maybe it's to apologize for the notes. I'm not sure. Thank you so much. Just some reflections at an early hour this morning when I sort of figured out how to work everything. I thought the image of the session was Don Tapscott's murmuration of starlings, this wonderful self-organizing control without any central control. that sort of captured the image. The word of the conference to me, and of course we don't hear what actually is said, we hear what we hope to hear, governed by our habits and passions and what we expect, was ecosystem. A lot of use of the word ecosystem, and a question I have is, when are we going to get serious about learning from nature? Everybody said we should. How do we do that? A theme was from the core to the edge, and yet this morning from Sir John we had the movement from fragmentation to integration. Paradox, opposites, tensions. And I sense that we're moving from a world of either or to a world of both and. You see, either or is a seesaw. More of this, less than that. It is an economist trade-off. I prefer what Mary Parker Follett used to call creative integration. Hard work, which Drucker would have agreed with entirely. You see, this weasel word balance, what do we mean by balance? It's a word we all use, but we don't understand. It's like a great sage who says we talk about reason and emotion, we talk about calculation and judgment, and we understand the concepts, but we don't understand the word and. Thanks.
Thank you, David. There is another issue that needs to be discussed. Managing business and startups in a political conflict zone. That was raised by Syed Mudassir. Okay.
As a suggestion for next year, or?
As something that needs to be considered next year, today, whenever.
Political fight zones is a bit of a broad term, I would say. Some people think it means war. Others would say this is the US. So, you know, we need to define that carefully. But this is an important topic.
Yeah. Mr. Remenet suggested, why are always the wrong people at such events at this forum?
Which means that he would see less of us here, or different people, or more. I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either.
I'm not sure, but I'll take one interpretation of that question, because I think there's an interesting way to look at it, and it's something that at the Drucker Institute we think a lot about, actually. So we see ourselves as a behavior change organization, and we have all kinds of programs that we try and drive organizations to do the right things and be more effective and responsible, and in turn contribute to a healthy society. But we tend, when we work with organizations, companies and nonprofits, and government agencies, they tend to be the ones that are already leaning in that direction, and we're sort of maybe helping them get there a little faster, but they're already believers, if you will. These tend to be organizations that have a strong sense of purpose, for example, right? Or they're probably not going to the Drucker Institute to look for guidance in the first place. So maybe one way to think about that question, it's actually a really interesting one. We all are probably preaching to the choir here, right? I mean, a lot of the areas where there was maybe violent agreement on many things, as Steve pointed out, because we all believe in these fundamentals, it's what attracts us to come to a Drucker conference. So it's actually, I think it's an interesting problem, if you will, which is how to start to change the minds, or at least engage in an interesting dialogue with those who don't share your worldview. So maybe an assignment would be, because of course everyone's going to come back next year, I'm sure. So maybe you have to bring one friend, or maybe one acquaintance, since it probably wouldn't be your friend, one acquaintance who doesn't share your worldview. And maybe we can consciously, some way, try to mix it up a little bit. And Richard, maybe you could have segregated seating or something too. So, but seriously, maybe there's some way to mix it up better.
So this is an excellent interpretation, which would explain the consensus, of course. Maybe another interpretation is something I live quite often with when visiting a client, is you discuss an important issue with, say, the Chief Information Officer, and then people would wish that the CEO would have heard the story. So there is, you know, either kind of a hierarchical dimension to that suggestion, or the one you were describing. And we need to think both of them through, I would suggest. What would be the next one, Lukas?
So this is a question from Fran Krug. How can we address the need to develop prepared future leaders?
There was a bit of discussion on that this morning, on the training of leaders, but obviously there is an appetite for more. Is that how you interpret that question?
I would say that in some sectors there is a very large experience of training leaders for this new economy. Particularly, I would say the software sector has probably the largest and most developed experience in doing this, and so one could learn from that experience. And it has been, I believe, largely successful, and certainly an experience that could be applied in other sectors. The other aspect of training leaders is to change the organization so that it encourages the kind of leadership we're talking about, as opposed to what many of the speakers described, namely a type of management that kills innovation, that kills enthusiasm, that kills trust, that kills all of the spirit that we're looking for in leaders. And then you ask, why don't we have the leaders we want? Well, with that kind of environment, one is simply not going to get the leaders. So changing the organizations is probably the most urgent task to achieve the kind of leaders that we need.
By the way, this forum itself is a learning experience, and that's why one needs the right people there, as said earlier. Rick?
Yeah, I would say in terms of just sort of business education and business school education, I think it's worth noting that the academics who are here, the scholars who are here, they really are outliers in a lot of ways. They are really broad thinkers, and being adjacent to a business school and being around a lot of business schools, I know that they are an unusual group. And I would just observe it's telling that Peter Drucker really isn't taught in business schools, which is kind of amazing. And I think there are various reasons for that, everything from, frankly, petty jealousy to the fact that he was not a traditional academic. He never did a regression analysis or anything like that. Barely has a footnote in anything. But I think the other reason is that business education is still so siloed, right? That the way Roger talked about, you learn finance and then you maybe learn marketing, and Peter saw it all as an ecosystem, right? It was all integrated, and it was all a holistic discipline. And since it's not taught that way, he's probably pretty hard to shoehorn into any one particular class, which is a shame and a problem.
Lukas, any more?
Yes, they're coming. Yeah. So, what I'd like to do is the following. First of all, thank David Preil for his suggestion, difference between complex and complicated. And he suggested that NGOs should be also included in future conversations with the question about what Drucker would have said about that. I think we have dealt with the last question here. And the last thing I have, and I need to kind of do this online, if I can. Thank you to Judy Hobrock. I will read as soon as I can. It's more than just 2 sentences, and I think it's quite insightful here. So thank you for the comments, and keep it going.
Very good.